Nice to see all of you. Good afternoon. My name is Margot Rollins. You are here for Waving in the Wind, one of Sonoma State University's Center for Environmental Inquiry's Spring 2021 Dig into Nature virtual series. My name is Margot Rollins, and I'm a program coordinator with the center. And until COVID hit us, our public events were held at either the Osborne Preserve, which is on Sonoma Mountain and Pengrove, or the Galbraith Wildlands Preserve, where I am up in Yorkville, Mendocino. And while we really miss having people on to the preserve for these educational events, the Zoom format has helped us reach a larger group of people, more broad, and we're pleased with that. At this point, we would usually pass around a sign-in sheet, but in lieu of that, can everyone please take just a moment to put your name into the chat box? If you would rather that it not be public, you are welcome to just chat it just directly to me so that we can see who's here. That would be great. So I have muted you all and turned off your videos, which you can control to some extent. But before I let our presenter take it away, I want to tell you all a little bit about the center. The center envisions a North Bay working together to find sustainable environmental solutions. And we're asking all of us together to get environmentally ready. We want to mobilize a community of learners, all of us here, and problem solvers, all of us here. And that would include faculty members, students, and community members, by providing enhanced understanding of our connection with the environment and skill building experiences that lead toward these sustainable solutions. We want to engage all of our academic departments at the university to work alongside us, turning education into action. And there are many ways you can get involved. You can get involved in research. You can join our naturalist training program, attend or lead events like this, access the robust data on our websites, make a charitable contribution to the center, partner with us in projects, and the list kind of goes on and on. Each of you really is a critical element as we work together to address the greatest environmental challenges the world has ever faced, frankly. But our leader today is Michelle Halberg. Michelle is a preserve ecologist on the Pepperwood Preserve in Santa Rosa, California. She oversees Pepperwood's community science and visiting scholars programming, as well as managing a multitude of on-site research projects, including long-term grassland and forest monitoring. The format that we're using today is a deep dive format. Michelle will present for about 40 minutes and followed by a 10-minute question and answer service. We're going to wrap up right at 3 o'clock. But Michelle has agreed to stay around for a few more minutes if you still have questions that she hasn't been able to address. Meanwhile, if something comes up and you have some problems and you need to put something in the chat, I will be paying attention to that, and I will either hold questions for Michelle, or if it's a clarifying one, I will interrupt her and ask her at that point. This is being recorded, and I will let you know when the recording becomes available on our website. So before any more time goes by, Michelle, it's to you.
Hey, thank you, Margot. It's a real pleasure to be here with you all today. And just make sure I can see everything. All right. I'm really excited to be here and to share with you all what's becoming an obsession, a passion for California's grasslands. So I have been the preserve ecologist at Pepperwood for 10 years, and in those 10 years, my love for this ecosystem is just growing and growing, and I hope to take you along with me on a journey, starting with really just a big picture perspective of grasslands in the world, and then zoom on down to Pepperwood and what we're doing and learning, and then ways for you to get engaged in grassland stewardship, maybe in your backyard or your neighborhood. And so with that, I'll get moving. So again, zooming out to this global perspective here, these are biomes. This is a map of biomes on the planet, and biomes are basically just really large, kind of broad vegetation categories that occur throughout the globe. And grasslands here are pictured by the yellow to brown color, And you can see that grassland communities, biomes, cover about 40% of the Earth's landmass. However, something to really think about is grasses themselves are present within almost every single ecotype. They're present in wetlands, they're present in forests, in the understories, savannas, you name it. So grasses are very ubiquitous and are prevalent on the planet. They are sweeping, they're epic, they often, blend with the horizon. They're high and rich in diversity, especially in California, where we have these kind of shallow wetlands like vernal pools that you see here. We get a lot of different wildflowers. So they're not just grasses, they're also wildflower species. They're lush, green, idyllic, pastoral, or sometimes dry, rustling, and brown. This is a picture from Pepperwood in the peak of summer, and most of the annual plants that you see here have gone dormant, and their little live embryos and seed coats are alive, waiting in the soils for when the rains come. But we do have species that are fully adapted to, dry summer drought conditions, like this gum plant or Grindelia. And most people, when you drive down Highway 101 or wherever you are, grasslands just look like fuzzy green hills, right? They're green or they're brown. There's not much going on there. But when I look at grasslands, I see a lot. You can take a few steps in any direction and your whole community could shift. You have a whole new suite of species or conditions that are present. This is one of my monitoring locations at Pepperwood. And when I look at this image, I see a lot of stuff going on here. I see thatch, which is old material from a previous growing season that's turning gray and oxidizing. I see shrubs moving in. I see rocky outcrops. And I don't know if it's kind of hard to see, but there's these light tan colors up here where the community has already dried down. It's already senesced. And that's often where we have shallow soils and you get a lot of really nice wildflowers in those locations. I also see a kind of what looks like a seep area here, and then bright green grass in that more wet location. It's most likely invasive harding grass here, but it has its own community and its own location that it prefers in environmental conditions. So there's a lot going on here. Grasses provide life, especially for humans. We've evolved with grasses. 70% of our agricultural crops are grasses, and corn, rice, and wheat provide more than half of our calories we consume. And it's kind of heartbreaking that the really diverse tall grass prairie in the Midwestern states is being replaced by a tall grass monoculture of corn. This here's a very generalized family tree, evolutionary tree, and the branch here with the green leaves that you see are organisms with chloroplasts. These are organelles, a little thing inside the cell that basically take carbon dioxide and sunlight and magically make sugars and oxygen, the things we need to survive. And at the tip of this branch, you can see grasses. So grasses are fairly recently evolved, and they are the 5th largest plant family in the world with more than 12,000 species. And the family name is Poaceae. It's written down here. Poaceae comes from the Greek word fodder, so it's very appropriately named. And scientists in 2003 published a paper documenting some of the earliest records of grass species, ironically associated with a dinosaur. So they were doing research on this hadrosaur, which is a duck-billed dinosaur. It's an herbivore from the Cretaceous period, about 120 million years ago. And they were looking at fossilized dinosaur poop called coprolite, which is fancy scientific term. So they were analyzing the contents of this coprolite and found what are called phytoliths. Phyto meaning plant, lith meaning rock. And phytoliths are made of silica, and grasses, as you may know, have a lot of silica content, and they produce these kind of crystal structures that have very unique shapes. And in some cases, you can identify exact species of grasses by looking at these phytoliths that can remain in the fossil record for millions of years and even in our soils for thousands of years. And so they looked at these phytoliths and determined that this hadrosaur was eating grasses that are relatives of bamboo and rice 120 million years ago. It's pretty cool. Grasses are really interesting as far as their anatomy. It drives a lot of people crazy, even botanists. We scratch our heads. It has a whole different terminology than most plants. So I'm not going to go into those details here, but the things I want to highlight are that they have hollow stems. And in particular, something that's really important is that most plants grow from what's called an apical merostem. So they typically grow from the tip. So the trees that you see outside, they're growing from the top. Of course, there's lateral nodes, but most of the growth is from that apical merostem. Grasses, however, have their merostem at the base near the soil, just like maybe a few centimeters above the soil. That's because they have evolved under severe herbivory pressure. And so by having their meristematic tissue down low, they can be grazed or consumed in a regular, fashion and not die. They survive and regrow. They also have features like rhizomes or adventitious rooting and tillers that go out. So if they get broken up at the base from trampling or soil disturbance, they can vegetatively reproduce as well. Grasses are flowers. Every time I host a wildflower walk, I have to stop and remind people, no, look at this grass. It's very beautiful. Get in there. Let's explore this. It does have flowers, and they're often really gorgeous if you hit them at the right time. This here is a spikelet of flowers. So this would be one individual flower here. And what you're looking at are the male parts here that have popped open. Those are the stamens that have popped open and released its pollen already. And then this feathery appendage here is the pistil, which is the female part that accepts the pollen. And they're just lovely to look at. Now, these grasses have evolved away from showy petals, away from requiring, a nectar reward in order to attract a vector or a pollinator to do their reproductive work for them. And those features are very expensive biologically. You need a lot of nutrients, minerals, things that might not be readily available. Grasses, on the other hand, dangle it out and let the wind do it for them. So it's a very passive way of reproducing. And unfortunately for us, that means if you're sensitive to pollen, like this time of year, it causes human allergies. So you can blame the non-showy flowering plants out there, the grasses, the oaks that we love, all of those are the ones contributing to your allergies, not the ones with the pretty showy petals. So grasslands in California, grasslands are so dynamic, they're vast, they are complex, they are constantly changing. They're really dynamic, and there's not much known about them. Like we're still learning a lot, and there's groups that are trying to come up with a better classification system so that we can kind of figure out, what are these grassland communities? What are these associations of species out there? And that's mostly work being done through the California Native Plant Society. So right now we have a really coarse, more geographical representation of these classes. Based on where these grasses occur. So we have valley and south coastal, which would be in this region, the north coastal region, which is where we are in Sonoma County, the cold and warm deserts, and then serpentine along the coast. And if you don't know, serpentinite is our California state rock. And it's a type of soil soil type, that it has a very unique chemistry. And so a lot of plants that occur there are often stunted. They're often found only within serpentine areas or endemic to serpentine. And so they have a really unique flora, including a lot of native grasses. And here's just some pictures kind of giving you a sense of what these grassland communities might look like. Here's the north coastal, most likely out at the coast here with coyote brush. And this is probably our California oatgrass, which is a native perennial bunch grass. Cold deserts, warm deserts, serpentine. Now, as far as native grass species, we boast more than 300 different species, and our grasslands support about 40% of the native species in California. So they're very diverse. And 90%, this statistic shocked me, 90% of our rare plant species occur in grasslands. So they're highly diverse as well as supporting rare taxa. Now, sadly, and this is kind of a common sad point within California, is that we have lost a lot of these ecosystems, right? Mostly due to human encroachment as well as invasion by invasive plants. And in California, we have lost 99% of our native grassland communities. And out of that 1%, about 88% are privately owned. So we don't know the fate of those remnant patches. We don't know if they're going to convert to agriculture, development, mismanagement. And just something to think about, especially in Sonoma County, we're one of the most parcelized counties in the state. I think, and so what happens is with all those dividing lines, the fate of these places is under threat. And grasslands in particular, a lot of the animals that are associated with them really need kind of like broad space. So it's hard to manage them and conserve them if they're so patchily owned and managed. So historical ecologists, if you talk to various people, some folks believe that California's grasslands historically were dominated by perennial bunch grasses like the one you see here. And these bunch grasses are, they don't create like a thick mat mostly. They're very sporadic and clumpy, lumpy, and spread out. And so there's space in between them where other animals and plants can occur, and they support a high diversity of species. These plants, because they are perennial, they live for more than 1 year. So they need to somehow survive through those long, dry summer periods and droughts. And they do this by having really extensive and deep rooting systems. So these flowers you see here are, of course, not grasses because they have showy petals, right? But these grasses that are pictured here have rooting systems that can go upwards of 3 meters or deeper to tap into that groundwater so they can survive those dry months. They provide food year long because they're green through the summer months. They stabilize soils. They help with water infiltration. So those deep root systems, water will actually percolate along the rooting systems and get deeper into the soils. They improve soil water holding capacity so that our streams can flow longer throughout the summer months. And they pump carbon into deeper layers of the soil. So there's a lot of advantages of having perennial bunch grasses in your system. Here are some examples of common perennial bunch grasses you'll see, throughout the county. Purple needlegrass is probably the most common native bunch grass throughout the entire state, and it's our state grass. It has these really beautiful, what are called long awns, these kind of needle-like appendages here, and they're kind of purplish if you get up close. Here's a close-up of the California oakgrass I showed in that coastal picture of the clump grasses. These are the flowers that you see here. California fescue is a bunch grass that you will often find under oak woodland or in oak savannas. Blue wild rye is a species that occurs on the oak woodland edge, so where there's a transition from oak woodlands or forested habitat into grasslands, and I just love the coloration that it has here. Big squirrel tail grass is this one here, and it's called squirrel tail because when it dries out, those seeds, the whole thing looks like a bushy squirrel tail. And then a native annual grass that occurs in Sonoma County that I just love is this tiny little annual grass is small fescue, and it turns this beautiful burgundy color when it dries down. So we have the bunch grass folks over here, and then on the other side of the spectrum, or maybe somewhere in between, we also have people who speculate maybe California was dominated by wildflowers, forbs, non-grass species, but then the grasses, of course, occurred throughout. In Southern California, we see evidence of this whenever there's really good rainfall years. We get these magnificent floral displays like in the Carrizo Plain, absolutely breathtaking. And these blooms are so huge, they're visible from space. But if if you're not familiar with where these things occur or these phenomena happen, you may just assume, there's not much there, there's nothing to really conserve, let's convert it, let's put solar panels out there, whatnot. but there's actually these dormant communities in the seed bank waiting for the right environmental triggers. They're really important to protect. Now, pepperwood, we don't have, and in the coastal California range, we don't really have those super blooms because we're not as water limited up here. But we have our little mini blooms that I'm very proud of, especially following fire. We saw a great floral response to the wildfires. This here is a picture of California goldfields in yellow, and then blue-eyed grass in purple. Pop quiz, is blue-eyed grass a grass? No, because it has showy petals, right? So it is not a grass. It's actually in the iris family. Here's blue-eyed grass a little bit up close, and blue-eyed Marys. Bird's eye Gilead, which is one of my favorites. It has blue pollen. So get in there, get close. You got to check it out. And then this really sweet annual leptosiphon. Some people call them whisker brush or baby stars, false baby stars. And we have multiple species, including a rare one at Pepperwood. But I love this name. Lepto means long, siphon tube. And so that's referring to this long floral tube here. And you can imagine what animal has to come up here and reach all the way down here for that nectar reward, right? It would be a nice butterfly or moth with that long proboscis, like this California ringlet, which is a grassland butterfly. It lives its entire life cycle in our grasslands. Or a dusky wing, a blue, or the predators that lay wait, like this orb weaver spider that captures its prey with a web, or ones that wait for the right moment to strike. Harvester ants are often seen in our grasslands, moving seeds from one place to another, walking to them what's miles to get to native grass seeds and taking it back to their nest. Mantises, the birds that eat these invertebrates, like these ravens. These are images here from our wildlife camera work that we have. Bluebirds. Two introduced species. I love this photo here. This is from our wildlife camera of a wild turkey and then the grazing cattle. And then it looks like maybe after we did our prescribed burn here. And then western meadowlarks. These are grassland dependent birds. They are ground nesting birds. They actually lay their nests on the ground. They occur in flocks and they're really gorgeous. They, if you see them, they kind of, if you startle them in the grasslands, they take off and they kind of hover like this, like chickens fly. And if you catch them in spring, they have these brilliant, especially males, have these brilliant yellow throats and a gorgeous song. Sadly, western meadowlarks are significantly declining throughout the state. And we have an annual breeding bird survey we do at Pepperwood, a point count survey. And fortunately for us, and this is just an indication of how important large grassland conservation, like large contiguous grassland areas are for meadowlarks as well as our land management. We're seeing a significant increase when the rest of the state is decreasing. So our stewardship is really beneficial to our local population of meadowlarks. And that's even after a drought and 2 wildfires, we're still seeing increasing amounts of meadowlarks. We have birds that visit. This is a threatened species, a burrowing owl that comes, I don't know if it's the same individual, but we've had burrowing owls for the last 3 winters come to visit our grasslands. The predators, the hawks and the golden eagles that fly overhead, the northern harriers, all feeding on the voles and the moles and the mice that the grasslands support, on up to coyote, bobcat, and even mountain lion occasionally utilize grasslands. At night, we have striped skunk in our grasslands where we do have grazing. If I go out there in the morning and I see a bunch of cow pies flipped over, I know one of these guys most likely went through and was eating all the grubs and the beetle larvae from the cow pies. Then this here is a North American badger digging area. So Pepperwood is one of the first locations east of Highway 101 that has documented North American badger since the 1950s. They used to be hunted out because these holes were compromised cattle. They could, hurt their legs, and so the farmers ranchers would kill them off. But since then, they've suppressed, that action, and so now they're coming back. And here is a North American badger caught on one of our wildlife cameras in 2013. And they do not stay, they just move through our area. They do not den in our area. So how did we go from this, rich, diverse, beautiful wildflower dominated or even bunchgrass dominated grassland to this? The Golden Hills of California, dominated by invasive European annual grasses. This is not a system that has been here for very long. It's actually fairly recent. So how did we go from one end to the other? And some folks speculate was most likely with the Spanish as they moved into the region. They brought with them their livestock, and they brought with them the livestock's favorite forage. And there are folks that talk about, and I haven't read this literature, so I don't know the specifics, but there are folks who talk about the adobe bricks and how they've actually been analyzed for their content. And you can see as the Spanish moved north, how the content started changing over time with the materials that they were using to build these bricks. And over time, they became more and more dominated with these invasive grasses. So it's a fairly recent introduction, only a couple hundred years. So what is that going to do long term? How are these dynamics going to change? How is the water usage changing? The soil carbon storage changing? The diversity changing, et cetera? So at Pepperwood, we, about a third of our property is our grassland communities. It's about 900 acres. And if you're familiar with the preserve, the Dwight Center is right here. And we are in the heart of the Mayacamas mountain range, northeast of Santa Rosa. And as you can see, even though we have a lot of large open grasslands, we're spotted with oaks, with mixed hardwood forest, Douglas fir forest, with chaparral. So there's a really rich mosaic out here. Here's a picture of the preserve in all these beautiful colors. The yellow represents grassland communities. But remember, grasslands and like an herbaceous surface occurs also within all of the light green in our oak woodlands. So we do manage our oak woodlands and savannas kind of similarly to the grasslands we have. Pepperwood is a nonprofit organization that privately owns this land, and so we are responsible for stewarding these 3,200 acres. And we do a lot of different management, and all of these points that you see and these squares, circles, etc. That's a subset of the research and monitoring that we're doing out here. We're really about looking at our Mediterranean upland system and monitoring the physical, the water, the hydrology, the soils, climate, and the biological, the ecosystem response to climate change and to our management. And we use all of this information to not only further science, but really further the decision-making processes we have internally, as well as other stakeholders or agencies that need these tools. And we're really working towards that adaptive management functionality. It takes a lot of time, a lot of energy, and a lot of conversations, but I think it's very important. And so one of the first things, I started working at Pepperwood 10 years ago, and one of the first things Michael shared with me is they had hired a historical ecologist named Arthur Dawson to revisit the 1850 census locations on the preserve and to look and see if he was seeing the same things that they were seeing. Because Michael had a question of, were these grasslands always grasslands? And so they went back to those records to compare. And he also hired Rand Evatt from UC Berkeley, who's a specialist in phytoliths. Remember those silica bodies, those crystals I mentioned grasses make? So he's a specialist, and he took a bunch of soil cores throughout Pepperwood's grasslands. Because you can imagine, if you need to steward 900 acres of grasslands, you want to know, was this always grassland? Should I be planting oaks? Was it a forest at one point and then it got cut down? What is the history here so that we can manage within the right context? And what they found is that it appears that the grasslands at Pepperwood have indeed been grasslands for a very long time. And in fact, we're most likely losing grasslands, which are the yellow areas that you see on this map, due to shrub and forest encroachment. And so that was a really good starting point for us to go, okay, we're going to manage these grasslands as grasslands. And if you're not aware, grasslands absolutely require disturbance to stay grasslands. So if you don't do anything to a grassland, shrubs are going to move in and then it's going to become a forest. And that's a successional story that is very well known. And if you have a disturbance to reset that cycle, it will eventually go back to a grassland. This here is a picture of the invasive medusa head. It's an annual grass, and typical of annual grasses, they will lay down a lot of material. They'll create a blanket. They'll squelch out any other plants that really are trying to survive there. They build up a thick, like really thick and deep layers of thatch, this gray material you're seeing here. So they're suppressing biodiversity. They're not helping at all with groundwater infiltration. They're out competing, natives and creating a fuel hazard for fire. Now, if you go in with some form of disturbance, in this case, we went in with cattle to remove the thatch layer, to punch it down and have it come into mechanical or actual physical contact with the soil so the microbes can start breaking it down and get those nutrients back into the soil. What you see are purple needlegrass bunch grasses that we had no idea was here, and they immediately responded to the light, the water availability, all the resources that it freed up. It was a really amazing response. So our native grasses are and forbs are waiting for disturbance. So we do use cattle as a tool, a management tool on the preserve. And we have a very extensive monitoring program that we do annually, and we track, how many cows we have. We highly regulate where they go. We use temporary fencing that we can move around. We can concentrate them in areas, keep them out of others, and we allow for a very long rest period, sometimes upwards of a year or more, so that there is an opportunity for, after that grazing, there's an opportunity for recovery. And what this does is it maintains structure in our grasslands. We still have shrubs, they're not encroaching any further than they really are already present. They provide structure for the birds, the ground nesting birds or perching falcons. And it's a very good tool. Ideally, we would have elk, right? But we need a lot larger of a complex of land than 3,000 acres to support a herd of elk. So unfortunately, with all of our partitioning of the land, we just can't do that. So we choose cattle. We also use fire. We have prescribed fire programs at the preserve, and this is a burn in medusa head dominated grassland. So we were specifically burning to get rid of this invasive grass. And here's a map of that location we did the burn in. I just walked every 10 meters and then stopped and looked around me and saw how much medusa head there was. So each black dot represents no medusa head on up to these large red dots, which are 50 to 75% cover. And if you know about percent cover, it's when you're looking from the top down, how much space is taken up by those plants. That's a lot of grass cover for medusa head. And so this was taken right before the fire and then 1 year later. So one prescribed burn did a really great job, and it's still there, and it kind of came back a little bit more after a few years. So we went back in and did a second burn. Now there's also wildfire. That's a natural disturbance. So Pepperwood in 2017, 95% of our preserve burned in the Tubbs fire, and then in the Kincaid fire, it burned another 60%. And this orange area you see is the overlap of the two fires. Now that's a really quick succession of back-to-back wildfires. So there's a lot of questions we have about fire frequency and impacts to our ecosystems, and how fire basically fought, and the firefighters fought the Kincaid fire in our grasslands and stopped it right at this location. We're very grateful for the work that they did. This is a picture after the Tubbs fire, just to give you a sense of, how black it looks. All this black you see are the grasslands. The prescribed burn I first showed you was right here, and then we followed up the following year with another prescribed burn for medusa head here, which did not burn in the Tubbs fire. So my point for this slide is to show you that grazing and prescribed burning can serve as wildfire fuel breaks. And the native grasses respond very well to fire. They're tapped into that groundwater, they'll green up, provide food for wildlife right away, and they take advantage of the nutrients and the light that's available. So now I'm going to quickly go into our actual monitoring that we do. So because we're heavily managing these grasslands and providing these disturbances, doing invasive weed work, fire, et cetera, we really want to know if we're having the impacts and reaching our objectives and goals. We started the project.
You didn't finish.
Yeah, I have a clock. Thanks. The project timeline here is just to give you a sense of how there is no normal in California. Since the onset of this project, we've had a historic drought, 2 historic water years, and 2 historic wildfires, and now we're right back into a drought. So it's just really important to have baseline monitoring take place, because this might be the new normal, it might get worse, and it's really good that we have this long-term project already in place. This is what a transect looks like. So it's basically a line. We have 32 of them across the preserve, capturing the variability of grasses at the preserve. And we run them upslope because we have so much variability in soil moisture and communities. And then we lay down a quadrat every 5 meters, and we document how much cover do these things take, how much disturbance is there, bare ground, thatch, etc. We do this project every year during the same calendar time, May 1st through 15th. So these pictures I'm showing you are from the same time every year. And at the start, there was lots of thatch. Here you can see early dry down because of the drought. And then here's what it looked like after the Tubbs fire, and a nice rebound right away with lots of biomass. So we can take this information and we can display it like this. This is a summary of the percent cover, the average percent cover of all those squares we look at, broken down by year. So each bar is a year, and then each color refers to what we call functional groups: bare ground, dry matter, native annual grasses, etc. We have the Tubbs fire here, and the Kincaid fire happened after this 2019 season that I'm showing you. The take-homes here are, we use this as an adaptive management tool. So for instance, bare ground here slowly started increasing, and it initiated conversations. We were talking, the ranchers were talking to the scientists and the land managers, and we were going, okay, where is this happening? How much is too much bare ground? What are our thresholds? What's happening on the land? Let's go look at it and talk about it. And of course, after the Tubbs fire, we had a lot of bare ground because everything burnt off, right? Another objective we have is to try to suppress invasive grasses. So this light color that you see at the top represents perennial grass, harding grass in particular, and we, through our grazing, we're reducing its cover over time. It could also be influenced by climate, but it's mostly just anecdotally influenced by our grazing. Sadly, the native perennial grasses were reducing, and we talked about it. And it was because at the peak of the drought, when they were the most stressed, we were also in there in some areas that we were monitoring at the peak of the drought in the summer months with the cows. So we revised our process. We no longer do that. We try to keep them out, and we're mapping where these places are so we can better protect them. Annual grasses and dry material, this light tan, have a really interesting kind of trend going on. So I'll just walk you through it real quick. One year we'll have a lot of annual grass cover. That lays down as the dry material the next, with less green. And it just oscillates. It's like this accordion effect. And that's been shown in grassland studies, throughout California. Where it kind of falls apart is when we have a historic water year. But after the Tubbs fire, we had barely any dry material because most of it burnt off. And all this material here, it doesn't look like much cover, but all of a sudden we get a laydown of a lot of dry material. And that's because cover, again, is from the top down. It's how much space you're taking up this way. But after fire, you have a lot of biomass, vertical growth. So it turns into material, right? And so we go out and we actually cut our grasses, collect information on above ground biomass, and measure how much thatch is there. Our grazing over time was reducing thatch over time, which is what we want. We want to get rid of that thick layer, right? Lower it down in depth. After the fire, we had barely any thatch, a ton of green material, and that immediately rebounded into a thicker thatch layer. So one question we had after the fire, it's all black out there, and we had no experience with wildfire before. The question was, how fast do grasslands recover following a wildfire? And through our monitoring, we went, ooh, rapidly. Let's get the cows back on. We actually do want them back on. Even though there's a ton of bare ground, there's a lot of material. And this is a picture of where we had the cows come through in the foreground. This is an exclosure where we have a transect to monitor undisturbed grasslands, and it was above my head. So we moved the cows through quickly, and we left material so that we wouldn't, exacerbate erosion in the winter months. So that's just a real win-win of this adaptive process. And so just another set of examples for how valuable adaptive management is in monitoring. These numbers refer to the number of quadrats or squares that are occupied by these species every year. And we found, early detection of goat grass invading. We immediately went after it, and we haven't seen it come back in that site. We can document that even though native grass cover is decreasing, the numbers for purple needlegrass are actually going up. So they might not be big, but they're there and they're spreading and multiplying. That's a good thing. We have stability of perennial grasses. So even if cover might be going down, those individuals are still there and they can recover over time. Or our invasives, we're not getting rid of them, but we're keeping them at bay. And then new invasives like false brome are coming in, they're increasing. Same with rosy sand crocus. And these are real threats to our grasslands. So now we're starting to talk like, how do we go after it? What are the techniques we should be using? Let's talk to others who are researching this. And again, this question of how much fire is too much fire, right? This is a site that had perennial bunch grasses in it, and it burned twice in 2 wildfires and in 2 prescribed fires within 4 years. Now it's a bunch of weeds. So we're gonna watch this and really get a sense of how frequently we should be putting fire on the land, as well as how do we respond to wildfires. Chaparral, when it's burnt multiple times, will go back and reset as grassland. As you can see in this twice burnt chaparral versus this once burnt chaparral. How do we best steward this? It's, after a wildfire, chaparral is temporarily a grassland. With lots of fire following species, how do we steward that temporary grassland condition so that it doesn't just get invaded with thistles and invasive weeds? And then ways you can get involved. Pepperwood is actively doing tons of grassland restoration. We have volunteer work days, especially when it's non-pandemic years, and we're gonna start reopening soon. There's ways to get involved. We go out and we actually collect native grass seeds. We teach you how to identify them and go out and collect them. We clean the seeds, plant them in our shade house, and then we go out and we plant them together on volunteer work days. This is a bulldozer line from the Kincaid fire, and we had an immense amount of help from our community to help us restore these areas. And a few months after we planted them, they were still looking great. This is purple needlegrass. Things you can do, these grasslands are highly invaded, and most of these invasive species come from humans, from our gardens. We move seeds all throughout the world. And so one of the best things you can do to protect our ecosystems in general is to have native landscaping, do weed control on your own property or help others like us who are trying to do it. Managing fuels to try to keep wildfires at bay. The more people we have in our wildland urban interfaces, the more fires are going to be sparked. So managing fuels is actually really beneficial for the ecosystem. You can volunteer locally, and you can also learn more about local regulations and government, and how you might write letters to the Board of Supervisors, you might look at zoning laws, et cetera. All those things, take active people to, help protect these important places. There's a great resource online through the California Native Plant Society called CalScape. So if you're interested in doing some landscaping with native plants, you can go in there. They have all these wonderful grasses, and you can tell them what kinds of, type in what kinds of conditions you have at your house. You can design and find nurseries to go purchase these beautiful plants. And then I just have to plug the California Native Grasslands Association. I'm on their board, and they do really great work on grassland conservation and education. They have a wonderful newsletter, and their website has tons of information if you're interested in learning more about our grasslands and the ecology there. They host workshops every year and are a great group of people. And so with that, I'll just end with some of the beauty of our grasslands following the fires we've recently had. And I really encourage you to just get outside, go take a look, get up close. You have to get down on your knees and belly and look at all of these wonderful plants and animals that are out here. And I encourage you to come take a wildflower hike with Pepperwood. We're hosting classes and events. Get involved more with your local community. Go out and hug a perennial grass. It's a lot of fun. Thanks so much for having me, and I'll take your questions.
Thank you, Michelle. Can you hear me okay without too much reverberation?
Yes.
Okay. So the first question that came in from Nicole Myers is, do you know where that, I'm going to mispronounce it, coprolite that you showed was found? And do you know that its age in millions of years and or geographic location where the hadrosaur coprolite was found?
Yeah, that's a good question. So it's a publication from 2003. And if I remember correctly, it was found in Asia, and it's from about 120 million years ago. So, but I don't have the specifics. Yeah. Off the top of my head, I'm sorry.
Can you talk about who eats what kinds of grass?
So as far as animals?
Yeah.
Yeah, I can talk a little bit about it, mostly in the context of cows, but I mean, there are species of birds, for instance, they specifically eat grass seeds. There are, gramivores, I think they're called. There's rodents love grass seeds and will move grass seeds around. But cows, for instance, like the California oatgrass that I showed you is a cool loving coastal species that we have. And when our cows were out in these, the peak of the drought in our grasslands, everything else is dried down. But the California oatgrass is bright green, and I've heard ranchers call it the ice cream of grasses. So cows tend to just go for it. They love it for some reason, and they will eat it. And it's true, they just ate it down, and everything around it was untouched. Even though it was still palatable grass, they could still eat, the dry material. They went right for the oatgrass. So it just depends on the behavior, individual behavior, as well as the species behavior. Deer and such, they're called browsers. So they'll nibble on things, but they don't preferentially focus on specific grasses. I do know that there's variability in the palatability of grasses. So grasses that are high in silica, like even our goat grass, it has lots of barbs. It's uncomfortable. And so some animals won't touch it. So it's highly variable. Yeah.
Okay. So what area on the Pepperwood map, or Sonoma County even, has the greatest diversity of native grass species, and what causes that?
That's a good question that I unfortunately can't answer because, like I said, grass communities aren't well known and they're not well mapped. So I can't pinpoint to, where specifically. But on the preserve and elsewhere, where I tend to see high diversity sites are cool north-facing slopes, north or northeast-facing slopes. And in these cooler areas, you will often get dominant native grasslands. So a lot of our coastal grasses prefer moist conditions. So you'll also find a high diversity of native grasses in wetlands, vernal pools, places like that. Yeah.
Okay. Was the stipa and other native grasses already there, or do you do the planting?
So, as far as our restoration goes?
Yeah.
Yeah. Where they bulldozed, so grasses, seriously, you take 2 steps one way, it's different than 2 steps over there. So they're a big mosaic. So it's hard to just generalize, but where they did bulldoze in that picture was predominantly native, mixed with a bunch of invasive annual grasses as well, but mostly native. Stipa pulchra is a very hardy native perennial grass, so it will withstand all kinds of conditions. We'll find it on dry slopes, rocky slopes, wet areas. So it doesn't have a small environmental niche. It's more of a generalist, which is why I think we still see it throughout California. It can survive with all of these annual grasses intermixed. So that's why we tend to use Stipa pulchra for our restoration, is because it's successful. Yeah, it would be ideal to also add forb species and try to, have a mixed planting palette, but that takes a lot of resources. And with wildfires, we did not have a budget for any of this, right? We were not planning on a wildfire, so we had to, use what resources we had available.
Sure, sure. Do you have a preference for maintaining grasslands through introducing disturbance, in parentheses, thus defeating the natural progression to shrubs and trees? And if so, is this a value judgment, or is it science-based with a specific goal, such as the suppression or preservation of species diversity?
So I just want to make sure I'm answering the right question. So is there a preference for specific disturbances or just disturbance in general?
Henry, do you want to ask that question yourself? You've been
Yeah, I was just wondering whether you had a preference for defeating the natural progression to shrubs and trees and keeping the grasslands. And if you did, that's the feeling I got from part of it. That was just a value, or was this with the specific goal of fire suppression or species preservation, or some other reasons why you'd be trying to maintain the grasslands over the natural progression?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. And it's something to assess at multiple levels. So of course there's going to be some value judgment, because we have to do that as humans, and we categorize things and put things into objectives and goals. But in the context of overall landscape heterogeneity, grasslands are gone, right? We're losing grasslands. It's one of the most threatened ecosystems in native grasslands in California. And so part of our objective for maintaining grasslands is to maintain that diversity that the preserve has in that landscape context, as well as on site. And recognizing that natural disturbances have been suppressed or eradicated. There are no more elk migrating. There are hardly, wildfires are not as prevalent, although we're starting to see the bounce back from fire suppression. So fires are more severe and can cause more damage now. So natural would be ideal, but we're not in a natural context anymore. Also, we are a part of nature and we are engineers of our world. And so hopefully these disturbances we're bringing on site is benefiting the overall landscape view and diversity. I'm starting to ramble.
We're just about ready to.
I love that kind of question though, because it's so true. When you are coming up with objectives, it's really hard to consider it all and then also come down to, okay, what are my specifics? Very challenging to do. Yeah.
So another question, how do you define sort of the size of the grassland? When does something become an actual grassland?
That's mappers come across this called a minimum mapping unit or minimal mapping unit. It depends. I mean, if you have a 5 by 5 foot little patch of grasses and it has no shrubs in it, that could be a little grass patch, a grass community. I think there's functionality though, like, yeah, at what scale does it really function as a grassland? Oh man, I don't think there's a minimum really. It's like, what is the context you're working in? Savannas are a grassland with trees, but to other people, it's trees with grass. So it depends what lens you have. There's the whole gradient. And then, but really like ecosystem wise, do small patches, and I'm not answering a question, I'm asking it, do small patches function similarly as larger patches? What animals and plants are supported in bigger contiguous landscape level grasslands versus small? I think it's highly variable.
Okay. Have you or the ranchers around considered beefalo? I'm thinking of bison, I guess they mean,
Oh, never mind. Oh, as a grazer choice, she's saying beefalo or the buffalo cattle hybrid.
Yeah, I don't really know much about them. So we opt for cattle because they're more prevalent, right? And the way they graze, the way their mouth is, they don't graze as close to the ground as say sheep or goats. Goats will eat everything as well, so you really have to watch them. And their hooves are a little bit larger so that they don't puncture into the soil as much as say sheep, especially because we have them year round. So they're out there right now when the soils are wet. We don't want to disturb the soils too much. So that's why we use cattle. We also work with Holistic Ag, is a company that is the cattle rancher who is on our property. And I don't know, he has a very specific mindset about how he grazes in a more conservation minded ethic. So I don't know if the beefalo would match with his objectives as his own company and business. That's a good question though. I could look into it more.
And then one final question is miner's lettuce a native grass?
Miner's lettuce is not a grass. At least the one that I'm thinking of. So the round shaped flower. Yeah, so that's actually a flower that you can eat. It's edible, but it's not a grass.
Okay.
But anyway.
Okay. Well, we're going to have to wrap up. We've got 3 minutes left to go. And I want to thank you so very much, Michelle. I think you did it. I mean, it was just a remarkable program from my point of view, and hope everybody else enjoyed it just as much, and that you learned about some things that you can do to help maintain our grasslands in the future. And as I mentioned at the top of the program, this is only one of our programs in our Dig into Nature series, and we invite you to join us for others. Our next one is called Healthy Planet, Healthy People, featuring Dr. Joshua Wheel from the Permanente Medical Group. And he will be talking about the impact of our natural world on our human health. And another one you might be interested in is in climate change in our watershed, which will focus on the Russian River area. I'm going to put, Michelle, are you okay if I put your email in the chat if people are interested in getting in touch with you?
Absolutely. Yeah,
Okay.
I'd love to talk more.
I will do that. And then if you have any questions for the center, the SSU, I will also put my email in the chat. And thank you very much. Hope to see you all again.
Thank you so much for having me. That was a lot of fun, you guys. Good questions.
Is that right, Michelle? Did I get yours right?
Let me see. Oops. Yep.
Okay. And I did say this, and I'm sorry to those of you who already left, that if people still had questions, you can unmute yourself, whatever you'd like to do, and ask away for a few minutes.
Well, I had a bird question in there only because I'm interested. I'm Maristela, and I work for the Mendocino County Resource Conservation District on the Willets Mitigation Project. And we are a huge adaptive management project where we use grazing to help two rare plants, the North Coast semaphore grass, which is a beautiful grass, as you know, and Baker's meadowfoam. And there's a lot of aspects. I'd love to collaborate more with Pepperwood because I feel like it's been going on for 6 years, but we're still, you know how it is. We're just learning so much as we go along. We have elk.
Oh, wow.
So we have a herd of elk. So that is a new aspect that we're working with. We are also supporting our local cow and calf organizations so that they can still maintain their livelihoods. But I was really interested in whether you have, because we do a lot of planting, we have rodent issues. And so we're putting in raptor perches and kestrel boxes, barn owl boxes, all of those things. I was wondering if you had any experience with those. And I can do this in an email because this is a long question. I understand. So we can email.
It's a good question, though.
It is a good question. Yeah, we don't have, because we're planting plugs and we're planting grass plugs, we're not really having issues. But when we did try seeding, and let me tell you, like, some of the seeds germinated, and the amount of money that goes into buying seed mixes and tilling, and like, oh my gosh, it's so much work. And we didn't get much success. And the more we're learning, especially after the wildfires, because we're like, oh my gosh, we have 23 miles of bulldozer lines to restore, in a few weeks before the rains come. What do you do? So we were scrambling and asking these kinds of questions. And most of the restoration practitioners who do this as a profession were telling us, like, yeah, if you seed, it's highly variable, and a lot of those seeds are eaten. Like, they're taken by the ravens, they're taken by the voles, etc. So, and it's really dependent on how long you have to wait until you get rainfall, how much you get, how frequent you get it. It's just, I don't know. I wish there was an easier way to go about it. Yeah, we haven't had much issues with rodents, but we have done some more restoration work in some chaparral and forests that were impacted from the fire. And we're actually having what we think might be a raccoon go after our, like, pulling plants out of cages.
Thank you so much, Michelle. I
So
really
welcome.
thought you did a brilliant job raising lots of good questions, and it was great.
It was a lot of fun.
Yeah.
Thanks. Have a good
Thank
day.
you.
Bye.
Bye.